In the fall of 2024, a mother sat alone in her home, unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. Her daughter, Kalie Goodwin, called her unexpectedly. The voice on the other end was not the one she knew. It was desperate, filled with pain and filled with fear. "Mama, my face is deformed." Those were the last words the mother heard from her daughter before the call ended abruptly. The mother could never have predicted what was coming next, nor could she prepare herself for what she would soon learn. A woman found dead on a Houston road. Another woman missing. Two women whose tragic fates are tied together by one name, Quan Flowers. A man with a history of violence. A man whose actions would intertwine the lives of two women in the most devastating of ways. Megan Rouse, a 24-year-old woman, was found lifeless on the side of a road. Kalie Goodwin, another young woman, would become a missing person, her last words a chilling plea for help. And all signs pointed to the same man. Investigators quickly identified Quan Flowers as a key figure in both cases. But as they began digging deeper, more details emerged. A witness, came forward. She described the encounter with Flowers, a man she knew only as Country. She recounted how he lured the victim into his dark-colored sedan, offered her narcotics, and then attempted to sexually assault her. During the assault, she heard it: screams, muffled sounds, and sobbing. The brutal assault she witnessed left a mark on her mind. But what was more disturbing was what happened next, the revelation that these women's fates were not isolated incidents. Flowers was not just connected to one tragedy but two. The discovery of Megan Rouse's body, riddled with bullets, and Kalie Goodwin's desperate phone call were part of a much larger, darker picture. A man with a long history of criminal behavior, Flowers' involvement in these two women's lives was the beginning of a story that would leave the Houston community shaken. In the midst of this investigation, a disturbing question arose. Was this a random act of violence, or was this a carefully planned series of events, each one leading up to the next in a pattern of destruction? And how far would Quan Flowers go to keep the truth buried? We begin by understanding the two women at the heart of this tragic tale. The first is Megan Rouse, just 24 years old when her life was violently taken from her. Megan was a bright and outgoing young woman, full of life and always ready to lend a hand or share a smile. She was the kind of person who would brighten any room just by walking into it, her energy contagious, her kindness genuine. Megan had a passion for life, for her family, and for the people she loved. She had dreams, aspirations, and a future ahead of her, much like any other young woman. But on that fateful day in Houston, Megan's life was tragically cut short. Megan's mother described her as the heart of their family. She was someone who could always be counted on to keep spirits high, even during their most difficult times. No matter what hardships they faced, Megan would always find a way to offer hope, to bring laughter, to remind them that everything would be okay. She was the one they turned to when life got tough, and her absence left a gaping hole in their lives. Megan's mother said she would always remember her as the one who made everything brighter, even in the darkest of days. Megan's murder was not just the tragic loss of a life, it was the loss of someone who was meant to do so much. She was full of potential. She was full of love. And yet, on that cold day, she became the victim of a violent crime that would forever change the lives of those who knew her. And then we turn to Casey Richardson, the mother of Kalie Goodwin, a woman whose fate would become intertwined with Megan's in ways that no one could have expected. Kalie's story picks up just days after Megan's death. On April 23, 2024, when Casey received a phone call that would forever change her life. On the other end of the line, Casey heard her daughter's voice, but it wasn't the voice of a woman she knew. Kalie was crying, begging for help, sobbing uncontrollably. Kalie's words were desperate, strained with fear and pain. "Mama, my face is deformed." Those were the words Casey would never forget. A simple, haunting sentence that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Casey's heart must have dropped as she listened, not knowing what had happened to her daughter, not knowing where she was or who was hurting her. What could she do in that moment? Her daughter's face was deformed, and the terror in her voice made it clear that Kalie was in grave danger. What followed was a mother's frantic attempt to piece together what was happening, to raise the $600 ransom that was demanded, the cost for her daughter's life. But what Casey didn't know at that moment, and what no one could have predicted, was that the very man responsible for her daughter's suffering was someone who had already been in the periphery of this case: Quan Flowers. Flowers was no stranger to the law. He had a long criminal history with several out-of-state convictions and a history of violent behavior. But how far did that history reach? Was it merely the result of one incident gone wrong, or was there a darker, deeper pattern to his crimes? Casey, trying to save her daughter, made a payment of $1 to a Cash App account that police would later trace back to Flowers' girlfriend. This small transaction would eventually become one of the key pieces of evidence that connected Quan Flowers to both Kalie Goodwin and Megan Rouse. But was this connection purely a coincidence? What was it that made Flowers such a central figure in both women's lives? Was there a reason for his actions, or was it simply the result of a violent and unpredictable individual? And what about the last words from Kalie, the words that described her injuries? What had happened to her before the call was cut off? Casey, in her panic and desperation, tried to pay the ransom, trying to save her daughter. She would later learn that Flowers was the one responsible for both women's tragic fates, but the story didn't stop there. The truth about Flowers' involvement would only grow more disturbing with every revelation that came to light. As investigators started to piece together the events surrounding Megan Rouse's murder and Kalie Goodwin's disappearance, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. This wasn't just the story of one woman who had been brutally taken from this world. This was the story of a man with a violent history who had affected more than one life, more than one family. And as the investigation continued, more people came forward with their accounts of Flowers' actions, his violence, his manipulation, and his unchecked rage. From Megan Rouse to Kalie Goodwin, it seemed that Flowers had left a trail of destruction behind him. But what was the underlying motive? Was it truly just about the ransom money, or was there something much more complex? A web of jealousy, control, and rage? Kalie Goodwin's suffering was just the beginning. As the investigation unfolded, more secrets were uncovered, and the links between these two women became even clearer. Megan Rouse, a woman with a bright future, a woman who was loved by her family, was gone. And Kalie Goodwin, a woman full of potential, was now caught in the grip of a man who had shown no remorse for his actions. Quan Flowers was at the center of it all. But what had driven him to commit these crimes? What led him down a path of violence, manipulation, and control? As we reflect on the stories of Megan and Kalie, it's important to remember that behind every statistic, every crime, is a person with a history, a family, and a life that was tragically cut short. Megan had dreams. Kalie had a future. And yet, both their lives were taken by a man whose violent history was just the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing story. We now take you back to the fateful day when Megan Rouse's life was tragically taken. April 22, 2024, a day that began like any other but would soon become forever etched in the memories of those who knew her. That day, Megan's body was found on a road in Houston by a Houston Police Department officer who was responding to an unrelated call. But this wasn't some tragic accident, some unfortunate misstep. No, this was something far more deliberate. It was clear from the moment her body was discovered that Megan had not died by chance. The brutality of the crime, the deep lacerations on her body, the way her life was violently snuffed out, it all pointed to one conclusion. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a planned and calculated act. The police officer who first arrived at the scene couldn't have known just how horrifying the next few minutes would unfold. Megan Rouse, only 24 years old, was found lying on the side of the road in an area of Houston that had seen its share of tragedies, but nothing like this. As the investigation began, the officers worked quickly, but the chilling details of what had happened became apparent. The gunshots. 9 shots to be exact. 9 shots fired into the body of a woman who had no way of defending herself. The sound of those bullets echoing in the night, each shot more final than the last. When you look at a crime like this, you can't help but wonder, what was going through the mind of the killer? The act of murder isn't always about rage. Sometimes it's about control. And in this case, it seems as though control was exactly what the killer was after. A calculated act meant to silence, to dominate. The shots themselves told a story, each one purposeful, each one placed with intention. The way her body fell, how it lay on the ground, so still and lifeless, was a visual testament to how the killer had carefully planned the act. It's almost impossible not to imagine the fear that Megan must have felt in those final moments, the realization that her life was ending, that she was not going to make it out of this alive. As the investigators scoured the scene, they found shell casings lying next to Megan's body. These casings would later become a key piece of evidence. What's more chilling is that these very casings, when examined, were found to be connected to 2 separate aggravated assault cases. The bullets matched. And soon, the name of Quan Flowers came up as a person of interest. Flowers, a man whose past was already marked by violence, was no stranger to the criminal justice system. But what made his connection to this murder even more unsettling was the discovery that he had been driving a car that was linked directly to the crime. This wasn't just a random vehicle. It was his girlfriend's car, one that was traced back to a surveillance footage from the area where Megan was found. This footage, clear and unmistakable, placed Flowers' car at the scene of the crime. But the investigation didn't stop there. The more the authorities learned about Flowers, the more disturbing the picture became. His criminal record was lengthy, full of charges and probation violations. And what made it even worse were the out-of-state convictions, each one marking a piece of a violent history that had followed him from one place to another. But what the police didn't yet know was how deeply Flowers was tied to another case, one that had already raised alarms. That case involved Kalie Goodwin, a woman who had gone missing just days after Megan's death. The investigation was growing broader, and as it did, the dots began to connect in unsettling ways. For the police, the facts were beginning to align in a way that was impossible to ignore. Flowers was now not just a suspect in Megan's murder. He was a person of interest in a much larger story. The brutal murder of Megan Rouse was just one part of a much bigger, much darker web of crimes. And what of Kalie Goodwin? Her disappearance wasn't just another missing persons case. It was becoming another chilling chapter in this growing story. The circumstances surrounding Kalie's disappearance were unsettling. Her mother had received a ransom call, one that would be forever imprinted in her mind. The voice on the other end of the phone was her daughter's, but the words were nothing short of a mother's nightmare. Kalie's voice trembled with fear, desperation, something that no mother should ever have to hear. "Mama, my face is deformed." It was a cry for help that carried across the phone lines, filled with terror, filled with pain. The words cut through the air, a stark indication that Kalie was in immediate danger. But there was more, so much more that would come to light as the investigation unfolded. The call came just one day after Megan's body was found, and the timing of it was far too coincidental. Quan Flowers' name, already at the center of the investigation, now began to surface in connection with Kalie's situation. In her desperation, Casey Richardson, Kalie's mother, made the decision to pay a small amount. The ransom demand was $600, but what she didn't know then was that she was stepping deeper into a world of lies, manipulation, and murder. Casey, in an effort to save her daughter, paid just $1 to the Cash App account linked to Flowers' girlfriend. The payment, though small, became an essential piece of evidence in tying Flowers directly to both women's fates. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Flowers had picked up Kalie, under the direction of an unknown male, just days before the ransom call was made. The horrific violence in Houston, the dead body of Megan Rouse, and the missing Kalie Goodwin were now tied together in a web of horror and criminality. The shell casings found next to Megan's body were now linked to a series of violent assaults. Kalie's ransom call, the bruises and injuries described in her voice, painted a picture of unimaginable suffering. What happened next, in the hours that followed, would shock the world. Quan Flowers, whose name was now forever connected to these two women, would be forced to confront the truth of his actions. But what exactly had happened to Megan? What had transpired between her and Flowers on that cold night? Why had Megan been targeted, and why did Flowers resort to such brutality? And what about Kalie? Was she still alive, or was her fate sealed in the same twisted way Megan's had been? The investigation was unfolding quickly, but still the answers were elusive. The crime scene told part of the story, but it was what happened in the shadows, the unseen moments that led up to the violence, that would be key to understanding the full extent of Flowers' crimes. And so, we turn to the moments that led to the murder of Megan Rouse, and to the still ongoing search for the truth about Kalie Goodwin. The events are tragic, the pain is deep, and the wounds left behind will never truly heal. But the answers, though far from easy to uncover, are out there. And the investigation, no matter how long it takes, will continue to seek them. I invite you to drop your favorite emoji in the comments below since you have watched this far. Let's continue the conversation and honor these lives. Hit the subscribe button if her life, though tragically taken, is a reminder of how important it is to recognize the subtle signs of jealousy, obsession, and manipulation before it's too late. Hit the subscribe button. As the investigation into Megan Rouse's murder progressed, the focus quickly shifted. Megan's tragic death had already sent ripples of grief through her family, but now something else was emerging from the shadows. Kalie Goodwin, a woman whose life had seemingly vanished into thin air. Casey Richardson, Kalie's mother, had already experienced the heart-wrenching loss of one child. She never thought she would be facing another nightmare of this magnitude. And yet, just days after Megan's body was found, she was thrust into an even more troubling situation when she received the ransom call. The voice on the other end of the phone was unmistakably Kalie's. But this wasn't the voice of the vibrant young woman Casey knew. This was the voice of someone in sheer distress, someone clearly terrified. "Mama, my face is deformed." Those words that no mother should ever have to hear, pierced the air. Kalie's frantic plea was unmistakable, the sound of fear, pain, and confusion. The urgency in her voice could not be denied. The moment Casey received that call, she knew this wasn't just a random act. This was something intentional, something planned. Someone had taken her daughter, and whoever it was had no intention of letting her go easily. But it wasn't just the call that raised red flags for authorities, it was what came after. A payment of $1. It may have seemed like a trivial amount, but to investigators, it was a pivotal piece of evidence. The transaction was traced to a Cash App account belonging to Flowers' girlfriend. This was no coincidence. Flowers, a man already in the spotlight due to his connection to Megan's murder, now found himself tied to Kalie's disappearance in a way that couldn't be ignored. As detectives began to piece the evidence together, the case against Quan Flowers grew stronger. They were now dealing with more than one crime, more than one woman's fate intertwined with his. Megan Rouse and Kalie Goodwin had been drawn into the orbit of a man who, it seemed, had no conscience. The investigation dug deeper, and soon the narrative being pieced together was far more disturbing. Flowers had been caught on surveillance footage. His car, the one he had been driving when Megan Rouse was found dead, was traced to areas connected to Kalie Goodwin's disappearance. Flowers had picked Kalie up, or so he claimed. The problem, however, was that his story seemed to shift every time he was questioned. Initially, he stuck to a story that he had picked up Kalie under the direction of an unknown male. The details were vague, the explanations half-formed, and when investigators pressed him for more information, Flowers' answers grew increasingly erratic. What was once a man who seemed composed now appeared unnerved, almost desperate. The more the detectives pushed him, the more his behavior betrayed him. He was no longer the calm, collected man he had once seemed to be. Flowers' story kept changing, and with each change his credibility slipped further and further. Was it guilt manifesting itself in his erratic responses, or was he simply trying to cover up the truth? Either way, investigators knew they were getting closer. Quan Flowers wasn't as innocent as he appeared, and his attempts to cover his tracks were only making him more suspicious. As the investigation into Kalie's disappearance deepened, detectives made another startling discovery. The last known movements of Kalie Goodwin were shockingly close to where Megan Rouse had been found. Was it just a coincidence? Could it be that Flowers had been in the area that day, that night, and had been involved in both women's tragic fates? The proximity of their locations was a lead too significant to ignore. Flowers seemed to be at the center of it all, and the more investigators examined the pieces, the more they began to wonder, how many lives had he already affected? How many times had he crossed the line between right and wrong before these murders? But the questions didn't stop there. As the search for Kalie intensified, it became clear that the circumstances surrounding Megan Rouse's death and Kalie Goodwin's disappearance weren't isolated. They were linked. The violent actions that led to Megan's death mirrored the brutality that had been inflicted on Kalie. It seemed as though Flowers was no stranger to violence, and his control over the situation was evident in the way he had manipulated everyone around him, including the victims. And yet, what was it that made him do it? Was it jealousy? Power? Or did he simply see people as tools to be used and discarded? Megan Rouse had been shot 9 times, a number so deliberate that it couldn't have been an accident. Kalie Goodwin, too, had endured unimaginable suffering. The ransom call was a cry for help, but it was also a sign of the abuse she had endured. How much did Flowers know about the pain he was inflicting on these women? Or was he too focused on his own desires and need for control to care? As the investigation moved forward, it became clear that this was no random act of violence. Megan's death was no accident, and neither was Kalie's suffering. These were acts committed with intent, with malice, and Quan Flowers was at the center of it all. What happened next would only add to the complexity of the case, as the investigators continued to piece together the dark truth behind the actions of a man whose criminal history was long, whose motivations were unclear, and whose grip on reality seemed to be slipping away. But for now the questions remained. What had motivated Flowers? Why had he turned so violently against women, one after the other? And most importantly, what would the investigation reveal next? Would the truth finally come to light, or would Flowers continue to manipulate the investigation, leading everyone on a twisted path of lies and deception? The clock was ticking, and each new detail uncovered brought them one step closer to the answer. But as the investigation raged on, the one thing that remained clear was this: Quan Flowers was no ordinary criminal. His actions had left a trail of destruction, and the consequences of his choices were far-reaching. The tragic fate of Megan Rouse and Kalie Goodwin was far from over, and the truth about Flowers would only come to light through the determination of those committed to bringing justice to the women he had harmed. Flowers' bond was set at $450,000, a sum that reflected the gravity of the charges against him. But for the Rouse family, this was just the beginning. The trial that would follow promised to be an intense battle of wits, strategies, and the pursuit of justice for Megan. As the trial date drew near, the courtroom began to fill with spectators, some of whom had followed the case from the very beginning. Megan's family, already reeling from the tragic loss, now found themselves thrust into a different kind of emotional turmoil. They would be forced to relive every painful detail of Megan's life and death in front of a public audience, all while waiting for the court to deliver the justice they so desperately needed. For them, this wasn't just a trial, it was a chance to confront the man who had so violently stolen their daughter, sister, and friend from them. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the case against Flowers. They presented a meticulous timeline of events, tying him to the crime with a series of incriminating pieces of evidence. The surveillance footage showing Flowers' car at the scene, the connection between the shell casings found near Megan's body and previous assaults linked to Flowers, each revelation chipped away at any defense he might have had. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that made the case so damning. It was the pattern of violence that Flowers had left behind, one that stretched back through his criminal history. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man whose history was defined by aggression, manipulation, and a complete disregard for human life. They showed the jury that Flowers had a pattern of abusive behavior, a man who had built his entire life around exerting control over others. It wasn't the first time Flowers had been linked to violent acts. His criminal past, filled with drug-related charges and assaults, painted a grim picture of the kind of person the jury was dealing with. But despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Flowers refused to take responsibility. Throughout the trial, he maintained his innocence. He claimed that he had nothing to do with Megan's murder. His defense team, desperate to find some shred of hope, argued that his actions had been driven by a moment of rage. They tried to convince the jury that this wasn't premeditated, that the murder had been a spontaneous act of violence, triggered by emotions he couldn't control. But the prosecution wasn't swayed. They had a clear, concise argument. Flowers had planned this, and the brutality of the crime spoke to the level of malice involved. Witness after witness took the stand, with Megan's family giving emotional testimonies that made it clear how much she had meant to them. Megan's mother, in particular, took the stand to describe the daughter she had lost, speaking of her vibrant spirit, her caring nature, and the hole that would never be filled in their family. The pain in her voice was palpable, each word a reminder of the life lost in such a brutal and senseless way. The jury couldn't help but feel the weight of her words, and they knew as the trial progressed that they weren't just judging a crime, they were judging the life of a woman who had been loved by so many. The defense tried their best to poke holes in the prosecution's argument. They questioned the credibility of some of the witnesses and attempted to undermine the strength of the physical evidence. But the cracks in their defense grew larger with each passing hour. Every attempt to shift the focus away from Flowers' actions was met with an unwavering push from the prosecution, who skillfully reminded the jury of the shocking details. Megan had been shot 9 times. And that wasn't the only thing that pointed to Flowers as the perpetrator. The timeline of events, the connection between Megan's murder and the missing woman Kalie Goodwin, and the links to Flowers' criminal history only added more weight to the argument. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The defense had tried to cast doubt, but it was clear to most that Flowers had not only committed a heinous act, but had done so with purpose and precision. He had been lying from the very beginning, and it became evident that he was trying to manipulate the system, just as he had manipulated those around him for so long. Then came the final moments of the trial. The prosecution gave their closing argument, urging the jury to hold Flowers accountable for the suffering he had caused. They asked the jury to consider Megan's life, the woman she could have been, the things she could have done. They asked them to think of the family that would never be the same. And in that silence, the courtroom hung on every word. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for mercy. They argued that Flowers had been under duress, that he hadn't meant to kill Megan, that it had been a crime of passion. But in the end it wasn't enough. The jury deliberated, and after what felt like an eternity, they returned with their verdict. Quan Flowers was found guilty of first-degree murder. As the verdict was read aloud, there was no celebration in the courtroom. For Megan's family, the relief was tempered by the weight of the loss they had endured. Justice had been served, but it could never bring back their daughter, their sister, their friend. And as Flowers was led away in handcuffs, they knew that nothing would ever truly make the pain go away. But while Flowers' conviction was a victory for Megan's family, it was also a reminder of the cost of violence. The trial had revealed the ugly truth about Flowers' character, but it also left lingering questions. What had driven him to this? What had happened to turn him into the man who could commit such a brutal act? Had it been a lifelong pattern of aggression, or had something triggered this violence that had remained hidden until now? Flowers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but that sentence seemed almost insignificant in comparison to the life he had taken. And as he was escorted out of the courtroom, the story of Megan Rouse and Kalie Goodwin didn't end there. Megan's family could take solace in the fact that Flowers would never see the light of day outside of prison again, but they would still have to live with the memories of the woman they had lost and the pain they had to endure. For now, Flowers had been caught, convicted, and sentenced. But the true story behind the man's actions would always linger in the background, a haunting reminder of what happens when a life is taken, and a family is left to pick up the pieces. The truth had come out, but the question still remained. Why had it come to this? Was there more to Flowers' history than anyone could ever have known? As the court session ended, the impact of the case continued to reverberate through the community, leaving a lasting mark on those who had been involved, and on the families of the victims who would never forget the trauma caused by a man who thought he could get away with murder. Quan Flowers' life was irrevocably changed. Sentenced to life in prison, he would never again see the light of day as a free man. His brutal acts had sealed his fate, but for those left behind, the pain was far from over. Flowers' conviction in the murder of Megan Rouse was seen as a victory for justice. Yet it raised more questions than it answered. There was still the lingering mystery of Kalie Goodwin, the woman whose fate seemed to be directly connected to Flowers but remained shrouded in uncertainty. Despite his conviction, Kalie's fate was far from resolved. As the gavel came down in Quan Flowers' trial, marking the end of one chapter, the story for Kalie's family was still unfolding. Kalie had disappeared under harrowing circumstances just days after Megan's murder, and Flowers was implicated in her disappearance. Yet, despite the evidence connecting him to the crime scene, Kalie Goodwin remained missing, and her family still had no answers. Fade to dark footage of empty streets, haunting silence. The public reaction to Flowers' conviction was mixed. Many felt a sense of relief, knowing that Megan Rouse's killer would never walk free again. But for some, the relief was tempered with frustration. How long had it taken for justice to be served? And why did it take this long for someone to finally step in and hold Flowers accountable for his violent actions? The grief experienced by Megan's family was palpable, but they had at least the knowledge that justice had been done, a small comfort in a world turned upside down by the loss of their loved one. But for Casey Richardson, the mother of the missing Kalie Goodwin, there was no comfort. She had heard the desperate cry for help on the phone, "Mama, my face is deformed." Those words haunted her every waking moment. Kalie's voice, trembling with fear and pain, had stayed with her, but despite that, there were no answers. Her daughter was still missing, and all signs pointed to the man convicted of Megan's murder. But what did that mean for Kalie? Was Flowers responsible for her disappearance, or was something else at play? Theories started to take shape. Some believed that Flowers had done far more than just kill Megan. Was he the one responsible for taking Kalie's life as well? Was her disappearance just another tragic consequence of his growing violence and disregard for human life? Was he stalking Kalie after his murder of Megan, or was there a different connection altogether? Others wondered whether Flowers was the tip of the iceberg. His criminal history was long, filled with a range of offenses that pointed to a man who had lived a life of manipulation, violence, and disregard for the law. Was Kalie's disappearance part of a larger pattern, or was it a singular act, a twisted incident that had occurred as Flowers continued his dangerous path? As investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, it became apparent that Kalie's case wasn't going to be easy to solve. The limited information they had about her last known whereabouts, her connection to Flowers, and the circumstances of her disappearance made for a complicated investigation. Had she been another victim of Flowers' uncontrollable rage, or had something else been at play? Cue to visuals of media coverage, interviews, newspaper headlines. The media attention surrounding Flowers' conviction only intensified the speculation. News outlets followed every detail, speculating on the motives, the connections, and the unknown truths that seemed to lurk in the shadows of this case. Interviews with experts, psychologists, and detectives painted a picture of a man who had a deep-seated need for control and manipulation. But was Flowers acting on his own, or was there someone else who had been pulling the strings, someone who had yet to be identified? Public speculation grew. Theories began to surface about other women, other victims who might have been tied to Flowers' violent actions. Was he a serial perpetrator, someone whose crimes had simply gone unnoticed for years? Or was he someone driven by the immediate need for power and control over the people closest to him, someone who picked and chose his victims based on his own twisted desires? Could it be that Megan and Kalie were merely the latest in a long line of victims, and that Flowers was only a small piece of a much larger, darker puzzle? The ongoing uncertainty surrounding Kalie Goodwin's disappearance kept the public on edge. Would Flowers ever reveal the truth about what happened to her? Would Casey Richardson ever get the answers she so desperately sought? The emotional toll on Kalie's family was unimaginable. While they awaited news, they were haunted by the fear that they would never get the closure they needed. And in the wake of all the unanswered questions, a sense of dread continued to hang over them. Many wondered, if Flowers knew what happened to Kalie, why hadn't he confessed? Was he protecting someone? Or was he just so consumed by his own narcissism and rage that he couldn't comprehend the consequences of his actions? No one could say for certain. What they did know was that as long as Kalie remained missing, the case would never truly be closed. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the questions continued to grow. What really happened to Kalie Goodwin? Was she another victim of Quan Flowers, or was there something else at play? Theories continued to abound, and speculation only deepened the mystery of her disappearance. For Casey Richardson, the pain of not knowing was unbearable. She had hoped that with Flowers in prison she might find some comfort, but the questions about her daughter's fate remained as painful as ever. And with each passing day, the fear grew that the truth about what happened to Kalie might never come to light. Ultimately, the theories surrounding Kalie's disappearance, and Flowers' role in it, would continue to be the subject of much speculation. The case, while partially resolved with Megan Rouse's murder conviction, left behind an unsettling feeling. A feeling that perhaps the full extent of Flowers' crimes had yet to be revealed. And as long as Kalie remained missing, that feeling would only grow. Questions remain unanswered, and until the truth is finally uncovered, the story of Kalie Goodwin will continue to haunt those who are left behind. For Megan's family, justice had been served, but the emotional scars would never truly heal. For Kalie's family, the fight for the truth continues. And for Quan Flowers, even behind bars, the questions surrounding his past, his actions, and the true extent of his crimes remain as unanswered as ever. Even though the court has found justice for Megan, Kalie Goodwin's fate continues to hang in the balance. Her voice, that haunting cry for help on the phone, still echoes in the minds of those who loved her. And as time passes, the mystery only deepens. Flowers' silence in the face of this grief raises even more questions. Was he the one who took Kalie? Or was he a pawn in something far more twisted? What is the truth that has yet to be uncovered? As investigators continue to piece together the puzzle, the lingering question remains, how much of this story is still unknown? And how much of it will forever remain a mystery? Megan Rouse's family has finally seen justice, but their pain remains. They are left to carry the burden of their loss, just as Casey Richardson, Kalie's mother, continues to carry the heavy weight of not knowing what happened to her daughter. Each passing day without answers only compounds their grief. Casey's search for closure is a reminder of how many lives are impacted when the truth is buried in silence. What really happened to Kalie? Was Flowers truly involved in her disappearance, or was there someone else, a force yet to be exposed, playing a role? What is the truth behind her missing voice? These are the questions we may never fully know the answers to. But one thing is clear: justice isn't always immediate, and it doesn't always bring peace. It's something more profound, more difficult to accept. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think really happened? Was Quan Flowers truly responsible for Kalie Goodwin's disappearance, or was there someone else involved? Drop your thoughts, theories, and questions in the comments below. We want to hear from you and continue the conversation. Your perspectives are just as important as the facts we've uncovered. If you found this case as haunting and disturbing as we did, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe. Turning on post notifications ensures that you won't miss any of our future stories. Stories that dive deep into the darkest corners of crime, truth, and justice. Thanks for watching Bruised Voice. Stay aware, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next video, where we continue to uncover the truths others might never want to face.